I'm going to call him that. Okay.
Okay. Well, you know, I'd like to say hello to everyone officially. And I think I'd like to go ahead and call the forum to order now, if I may. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Connie Nestor, and I've had the pleasure to chair the Scottish American History Forum these last 10 years. And I would like to wish you all a hearty welcome today.
Got it.
But before we begin our presentation with question and answer session at the end, so please be getting your questions ready for Sir Tom. And by the way, we will be recording this, so I'd like everyone to be aware of that. We are very delighted to have Gus Noble join us as well today. And Gus is the president of Caledonia and of the Chicago Scots. And he is here to greet us and to say a few words. And Gus, we'd love to hear from you now.
Hi, good morning, Connie. Good morning, Sir Tom. How is everyone? I hope you're very well.
It's wonderful to hear. It's wonderful to hear an accent which has been refined at the University of Stirling.
Gus, we can't see you, Gus. If you can turn your camera on. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sorry. My computer rebooted. Thanks to Apple, they installed a new operating system, and I'm calling in on my phone. So bear with me just for a moment. Perhaps if I could, I'll just, rather than try and fidget with my phone, I'll just say a few words and then try and get the computer on when that time comes.
Yes, please.
What I wanted to say was, once upon a time, someone told me that Professor Tom Devine is the rock star of Scottish history. And I know that to be true because I've read many of Tom's incredible books, and during many of my long commutes through Chicago's uncharitable traffic, I've had my sanity saved many times by his podcasts. And during the summer of 2009 at the Scottish Diaspora Forum, I sat in a lecture theatre at Edinburgh University and listened to Sir Tom deliver a presentation that more than a decade later resonates to inspire new thought. And after that lecture, I joined Sir Tom and a few others for dinner, and we discussed many things, including the concepts of home and family and the fundamental purpose and mission of the meaning of the Chicago Scots mission to nourish Scottish identity. So I know it to be true, whether it's over a pen or a plate or a podium or a podcast. Sir Tom Devine offers the highest return on your investment of time and attention. But the rock star of Scottish history, what does that mean? Is he the Beatles or Black Sabbath? Is he the Stooges or the Shadows?
The Shadows.
There you go. Is he ABBA or Zappa? The best rock stars to me, and I love my music, they inspire and assure, but they also challenge and can unnerve. They offer, to quote Sir Tom, red meat to attract the useful attention of others, to raise up the game. So I think we can do better than describe Sir Tom Devine simply as the rock star. I think, as his star burns brighter and more influentially than most others, he is in fact the Bob Dylan of Scottish history. So I thank Sir Tom for sharing his time with us today, and I thank you, Connie, for making moments like this happen. Thank you.
Well, that pretty much says it all.
Can I just say thank you to Gus?
Yes, please.
In fact, I am not only flattered but reassured by your comments, Gus. But I've just asked Connie: is your first name Augustus? And
no, it's not.
Gus
it's Angus.
It's Angus, right?
Because the place where
At first, I thought your parents might be classical scholars.
No, they're
Having called you
unfortunately
Augustus.
they called me after the place I was born.
Right.
So no classical scholars, I'm afraid. But very cool people.
Sorry?
Very cool people, though.
Yeah, that sounds like it. Anyway, that was a wonderful tribute and funny as well. That's great. Thank you.
No bother. Thank you. I'm going to try and
Thank you.
get my camera fixed now, and I'll see you in a second.
Get it fixed so we can see you, Gus. And it's always a treat to listen to what you have to say. So thank you very much. It was very entertaining. But
Thank you.
now I think it's time to move forward with our presentation today. And I would like to introduce Sir Thomas Martin Devine. We are entirely dazzled to have him with us today, live from Edinburgh, Scotland. And he is the world-renowned and the Sir William Fraser Professor Emeritus of Scottish History and Paleography at the University of Edinburgh. And he is Scotland's most distinguished historian, having authored a host of priceless titles. You are all very likely to have his book, The Scottish Nation, in your personal libraries, to name only one. Sir Tom was awarded the Senior Hume Brown Prize for the first book in Scottish history, the Saltire Society Prize for the best book on Scottish history, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh Henry Duncan Prize and lectureship in Scottish Studies, in addition to many other awards. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the British Academy, the Royal Historic Society, the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and the Royal Society of Arts. Sir Tom was awarded the Royal Medal, Scotland's supreme academic accolade, on the authority of Queen Elizabeth II, and he is the only historian so honored since the medals were inaugurated by the monarch. He was made an officer of the Order of the British Empire for services to Scottish history and was knighted in the UK Order of Chivalry. In addition, Sir Tom was listed as one of the top 20 most powerful and influential people in Scotland by the Herald in 2015, which described him as the nation's preeminent historian who has reshaped the way the Scottish past is viewed. And Sir Tom has also been described as the intellectual heavyweight behind Scottish nationalism. Sir Tom is going to speak to us today on Scotland's greatest gift to the world, the Scottish Enlightenment, and how it came about. And we're in for a special treat, for he has promised a cabaret of esoteric jokes. I give you Sir Tom.
Okay, Connie, how can I possibly follow that? I'm humbled by that introduction. The only thing is it might actually create expectations for this presentation that I can't possibly deliver.
We doubt that.
I should say that the jokes or comic references, maybe one or two of them may occur during the presentation, but there'll be more of them at the very end as we end up in hopefully a harmonious note for this particular event. Well, I'm actually delighted to say that I'm honoured by the Chicago Scots, led by Gus and Connie, to do this presentation. I've never spoken in Chicago before, even through the internet, although I have spoken in many other parts of the USA. And one accolade that Connie didn't mention, I was honoured to receive the Wallace Medal of your equivalent in New York, Scottish American group in that city. So the issue is this. First of all, what is this phenomenon that I want to discuss in the 18th and early 19th centuries? And secondly, and this is the area that I'm particularly interested in exploring, why did it come about? In 1764, the great French philosophe Voltaire stated publicly, and I quote, "We look to Scotland for all of our standards of civilization." It's become quite a well-known citation. And of course, you know, until recently at least, historians have regarded France as par excellence, the locus classicus of the Enlightenment in Europe. So first of all, in what way would I describe the features of this phenomenon? And it has to be said at the beginning that the term the Scottish Enlightenment was never publicized until 1900, when a Glasgow University professor called W.R. Scott, who was actually an economic historian, declared that the period between about the 1720s and the end of the 18th century could be dubbed the Scottish Enlightenment. And you can understand by the term Enlightenment that what Scott was referring to was, if you like, a cultural and intellectual awakening out of darkness, the darkness of the pre-Enlightenment period, and the flourishing then of this extraordinary, completely unprecedented period of intellectual and cultural vitality in Scotland's history before, and never again achieved to the present day. I'm going to question the darkness before the so-called Enlightenment later, but leave it there as a kind of pause. I suppose the traditional view, certainly in Scotland and those who love Scotland, has been that the Scottish Enlightenment was, if you like, a collection, almost a squadrone of high-powered intellectuals and artists and literary people. And it is extraordinary, to use that word again, that between the 1720s and the early 19th century, there's such a galaxy of intellectual and cultural superstars in such a short period has been ever achieved again in the history of the nation. I mean, just to list some of the great names, but this is in fact only a small summation of those who became such core features and agencies in the development of the Scottish Enlightenment. We start obviously with the great philosophers, Adam Smith, philosopher and political economist, David Hume, in my own view, still to this day, the world's greatest ever philosopher. We go on to James Hutton, a founding father of what we now call geology. We then move on to the literary giants, Sir Walter Scott, Robert Burns, and we move on then to the engineers, particularly James Watt, a key figure in developing the separate condenser, which itself was a fundamental force in the first industrial revolution in Britain. And then we also at the same time consider the historians like William Robertson. In fact, in my own university, the School of History, Classics and Archaeology, is located in the William Robertson building, a cleric who in fact masterminded many of the foundations of historical science. And not to forget the medical people who, you know, especially the University of Edinburgh's medical school, and to some extent also Glasgow University's medical school, who reached a preeminence globally and attracted students from all over the world in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And of course, the other thing is to mention people like Joseph Black, representing the scientific cohort, and William Cullen representing the medical scientists and teachers. I could go on at length because there were people below that high rank who also would be regarded today as very important minds, and certainly would be regarded as roundabout Nobel Prize rank in today's denominations. But I think we've got to look deeper and wider in terms of the definition of the Scottish Enlightenment. And we've got to look deeper in the sense that it was a part of the European Enlightenment. The European Enlightenment, which had various different hues, had various variations, but almost usually it had the commitment to reason, especially progressive reason, concerned with the amelioration of humanity on earth, and at the same time a rejection of tradition, as long as that tradition was not supported by evidence and rational exploration. And the other vital element in it, perhaps not least, and certainly the one I prefer and like best, especially in today's world of the 21st century, the axiomatic commitment to tolerance, civility in discourse, okay, disagreement, but then, if you want to put it in a colloquial way, once you've had the long set of arguments in the tavern or the pub or the hoof, then you have the drinks and the dinner, and you part in harmony. It's a wonderful cameo, if you will, of the way that intellectual discourse and intellectual argument should take place. But I think sadly in today's academy and beyond the academy, that is no longer the same as it was in the 18th century. We should always take the view that the future, or modernity, if you like, is better than the past, and that the past is necessarily always inferior to the present and the future. People in the past, especially the groups I'm talking about, weren't daft. So the other aspect which is important to acknowledge and to ruminate about is what was distinctive, therefore, if this was a European-wide phenomenon we're talking about, what was this distinctive feature or features of the Scottish Enlightenment? And there's been a lot of work done recently in the last 10 to 20 years to isolate or to place the Scottish experience in context. Certainly in terms of my own trade as an historian, over the last 10 to 15 years, I've always tried to use comparative historiography and analysis to plot what was specific and distinctive about all aspects of the modern Scottish history. Because if you don't place the national history in context, if you don't place small country history in context, it could be Ireland or any other small countries, then you're in danger of navel gazing, introspection, and really losing the ability to see what is specific to the country you're primarily interested in studying, and what is part of, if you like, general European or Western history at that particular point in time. So comparisons, in my view, are essential to modern historiographical science. And if you go down that route, then we find that these are the distinctive features, or at least among the distinctive features, because time means that I've got to be relatively limited in what I say to you. The distinctive features, not the unique features, but what made the Scottish Enlightenment slightly or significantly different from what was going on elsewhere in the other hotspots. The other hotspots, by the way, of intellectual endeavour in this period were the Low Countries, aka Holland, France, and especially the capital Paris, and the 2 or 3 of the German states, because Germany was not yet a full nation in this period. And interestingly enough, the Kingdom of Sicily at the southern tip of Italy, and Italy, of course, in that period as well, not yet a mature and developed state, which didn't happen until the later part of the 19th century. So one thing that's different is that in many of these other nations, the focus of Enlightenment activity tended to be at the court, tended to be in elite circles. In Scotland, it was emphatically in the universities. The universities were core, and university staff, especially professors, were at the forefront. And that has a number of effects on the impact of the Scottish Enlightenment, which we'll come back to later. The other very interesting thing, to me at least, is unlike France, where many of the Enlightenment figures launched a full-blooded attack on religion and the church, and of course in France it would have been the Catholic Church. Whereas in Scotland, two things are apparent. One, several of the Illuminati, several of the literati, were either sons of the manse, sons of ministers, or were ministers themselves. And at the same time, when you read especially the private correspondence of the major figures from the late 17th century onwards into the end of the Enlightenment period, around about 1800, 1810, when you do that, you'll see that one of the things they're trying to grapple with is understanding the world, whether it be the humanity that reside in the world or the world as a whole, that God has created. There was only one major figure who was suspected, not proven, but suspected of atheism, and that was David Hume. The rest were all churchgoers and committed to the Christian religion. And again, that has got implications for the nature and impact of the Scottish Enlightenment. The other thing I would say is range. To a large extent in the other centres, the philosophical dynamic, the interest in philosophy and related subjects, like history, for example, was central. But in Scotland, it covered everything from architecture. We're thinking here of the Adam family, headed by William and then his sons, with their beautiful incarnations, not simply in architectural sense in Scotland, like with Culzean and Mellerstain, but also in England as well, right through engineers to the more academic side of things, and also including individuals who were trying to put their learning to practical use, because one of the key buzzwords in the Scottish Enlightenment was useful knowledge, which is still the motto of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Scotland's premier, or Scotland's national Academy of Letters and Science. And that's also something which, to at least a significant extent, marked out the Scottish Enlightenment. And then finally, before I go on to the second part, which is to try and explore how this came about, and it is a conundrum, by the way, I warn you about that at the beginning, a puzzle, if you will. And that is the effect both nationally and internationally. One of the things which is clear-cut in the Scottish Enlightenment process is that those outside the walls, if you like, the walls of the universities, but who had experienced the universities as students and had been trained in the professions of the ministry of the church and in teaching within the universities, that they then became disseminators of Enlightenment thought, not perhaps in profound detail, but nevertheless the general influence. I give you, for example, the remarkable production called The First or Whole Statistical Account of the 1790s. Several 24, 26 volumes, or as a parish by parish account of the entirety of Scotia in that period, written and compiled by the parish ministers. When you read, you only have to read one parish chapter or a few more to discover that it's shot through with Enlightenment thinking. And then especially here in the national sense, before I go international, my last book was called The Scottish Clearances, Penguin. I should advise you at this point that all royalties for my works, if you're interested in buying them, all royalties go to my poor, impoverished 11 grandchildren. Not a penny goes to me. So when you're thinking about going into the bookshop or ordering online, think of those wee creatures who will be thankful for your assistance and help, your generosity of spirit. But the book in question, the Scottish Clearances, A History of the Dispossessed, 1600 to 1900, the first ever attempt to see clearance as a pan-Scottish phenomenon and not simply restricted to the Highlands and Islands, but very active and very important also in the borders and the lowlands of Scotland as well. And when you look at some of the thinking behind agrarian modernity, agrarian modernization, which included, it was only one part of the whole, but did include the removal of people from land and the creation of what the farming class and the landlord class were more efficient structures. That again was strongly influenced by the reason, if you like, the application of reason of the Scottish Enlightenment. If you look at the farmsteadings, the compact farmsteadings, which moved or developed out of Scotland by the early 19th century, in comparison to the higgledy-piggledy of the run-rig system in the old day, then you'll see almost the application of reason. If you look at the new town of Edinburgh, you will see the symmetry and balance in the streets. Again, the application of reason. The ethos of Enlightenment came out from the grassroots to some extent, but also fed back into the mentalité, into the, how would one put it, the mindset, certainly of educated Scots in this particular period. And then because I'm speaking to the Chicago Scots, I finally want to go to the external impact, especially the impact in North America. It's now almost a settled belief, an orthodox belief by most scholars, and I explored it in detail in another one of my works called Scotland's Empire, 1600 to 1815. It's almost an orthodoxy now that the Scottish Enlightenment had a major effect on the two foundation documents of your nation, namely the Declaration of Independence and also the charter, if you like, for national government, the new constitution of the USA. And the other thing which is important to note is that the College of New Jersey, aka now Princeton, and you can see the Scottish imprint in it, certainly when I was there a few years ago, and I've been 2 or 3 times at Princeton, where in the great chapel or church of the university, on the right-hand side in the place of honor is the insignia of the University of Glasgow, because that was the alma mater of John Witherspoon, who was the great founding father, not the first principal, but the great founding father, which gave Princeton its preeminent position, which it's retained until today. And then beside that, the saltire, the Scottish flag, all in memory of that period in the 18th century when it became a seminary of learning for government of the infant nation of the United States of America. We know that in the first 10 years of the American state, in terms of governance from president downwards, including judges of the Supreme Court, right down to the House of Representatives, no less than 74 men, because they were all men, had been educated at the College of New Jersey, or Princeton as it became. And for reasons I don't have time to go into, but I can in question time if any of you are interested, that the education that they experienced was replete with the thinking, especially in philosophy, especially in political economy, and especially in those disciplines which emerged out of the Scottish Enlightenment, such as anthropology and sociology, not called that at that time, but the beginning had been made, and through, of course, Smith, the discipline of economics, Adam Smith. And so that sort of mindset of your early politicians of the elite class, the mindset, the values, if you will, the political values and the intellectual values had been born in Scotland and had crossed the Atlantic in the 18th century, just in the same way as commodities and tobacco came in the other direction. So thinking and books and clerics and teachers who taught in many American foundations were formed in Old Scotia. So we move then to the second part, and to me at least, because I'm interested in analytical history, primarily. I don't think, given the number of years I've been writing that, I don't think I could even write narrative history anymore. In other words, a story of what actually happened. This is a puzzle, or a paradox, or a conundrum, and that's again one of my favorite areas for historical explanation. Let's go back maybe a decade or two before some of the great men I've mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. Let's go back to the period when they were born, just 10 or 15 years before they were born. In 1696, a young Edinburgh student called Thomas Aikenhead, the son of a surgeon in the city, was arraigned before the High Court of Justiciary in December 1796, because he had told his friends, possibly because he was drunk, he told his friends that the New Testament was the fables of the impostor Christ. For this, he was accused of blasphemy. He pleaded his young age. He pleaded contrition, but he was hanged the following January. The same January, 5 persons were accused and found guilty of witchcraft in the town of Paisley in the West. One of them committed suicide. The rest were hung almost till they were dead and then burnt at the stake. The thinking being that burning would at least allow them to purgatory. It would shriven them of their sins in the fires. That was the thinking. And at the same time, in the 1690s, the now resurgent Presbyterian Church of Scotland turned on its enemies, which it had defeated in the Revolution of 1688, turned on its enemies, the Episcopalian Church and Episcopalians in general, and really carried out a purge of ministers of that church and university teachers of that church in the 1690s. In other words, the last decade of the 17th century in Scotland has been likened by one scholar as like the governance of the modern Taliban. A bit, if you like to put it this way, at the extreme end, certainly in total conflict with the virtue of, or the virtues of tolerance, which were central to the Scottish Enlightenment just a generation or two afterwards. And this is obviously why W.R. Scott called this period in Scottish history in the mid-18th century the Scottish Enlightenment, because it was an awakening, as he would have put it, from darkness, the darkness of the passions, the obscurantism, the bigotry of the 17th century, the intolerance of that period. So how does one explain the movement? I remember over a very short period of time, And unlike our age, things didn't change very swiftly in the late 17th and early 18th century. They changed slowly because obviously the communication systems were entirely primitive compared to those of 2000 and 2021. A very common explanation, which is now regarded, before I give it to you, as nonsense, a very common explanation was it was the Union of 1707. It was the parliamentary union between England and Scotland, between, in quote marks, a primitive society in the north and an advanced society and nation in the south, namely England. That over time, after the union, the closer affiliation between the two countries, England and Scotland in the parliamentary union, if you like, had fertilized the semi-barbarous country to the south. And that was really the prime reason why by about the 1740s, after the influences had taken effect from the south, that was the reason for the flowering of the Scottish Enlightenment. One of the aspects of the revolution in Scottish historiography, one of the things you've got to remember is when Professor John Hargreaves gave his inaugural lecture in 1964, the year I went to university actually, he was an Englishman. He started his reflections on Scottish historiography by accepting that medieval and early modern Scottish historical studies had been thriving for some time. If you like, the history of the independent nation. But as he put it, modern Scotland, that is post-1700 Scottish history, was, quote, less studied than the history of Yorkshire, unquote. My experience as a scholar, because I was lucky enough to get my first post in a university in 1969, just a few months into my doctorate. So it's been my profession since then up till 2021, although I'm now an emeritus professor, but I'm still writing. It's been my experience to live through that immature period of Scottish historiography to which Hargreaves described, and the full flowering, to quote one Harvard professor, not a Scottish historian, but one who has an awareness of European and British history, when he concluded, the Scottish historiography is now so alive and vibrant that it can be compared to its ancestor of the 18th century, of the ancestor of the 18th century century Enlightenment. So some of the things I'll be saying to you in the latter part of this presentation, they're not exactly hot out of the research oven in the sense that they came about in the last few months, but certainly they are the fruit of the period from about the late 1960s through to the 1990s. There are some question marks over the period since the 1990s that I'm willing to speak about, but certainly that period from the 60s to the 90s was a veritable golden age of Scottish historiography. Important books coming out, one after another, and also learned articles in the journals and in book collections. So first of all, I've suggested the redundancy of the union, at least directly, as a cause of this thing. So I want to put forward, I think I'm talking here about three major planks, three major areas of explanation. The first area is to revisit the pre-1700 period and to say that it was in no way as entirely bigoted, intolerant, and faction-leading as the unionist historiography of the late 18th century, 19th and 20th century, up until the 1960s, 1970s. In other words, pre-Union Scotland black, place of perdition, post-Union Scotland becoming a more civilized country. Because in that period, Scotland had, this is now before 1700, Scotland had 4 universities, 2 in Aberdeen, St Andrews, Edinburgh. I mean, I never was very good at arithmetic, so it must be 5. 2 universities in Aberdeen, one in St Andrews and one in Edinburgh and one in Glasgow. And in the 1790s, another one beginning to emerge, which eventually became the University of Strathclyde in a later period. When England had two. And there was a question mark of the quality of those two, especially Oxford. Adam Smith, who never married, writing to his mother after he had been given an exhibition after graduation, after having been taught at a Scottish university, namely Glasgow, getting an exhibition for further study at Balliol College, Oxford, famously said in this letter, this epistle to his mother, the teachers here have all given up all pretense of teaching. They have become social parasites. I think by that he probably meant they were very keen on the sherry and the wine and the port, but he didn't actually signify this in a specific sense. I once gave a lecture, not on this topic, but at a big conference in Gleneagles Hotel in Scotland. And in the audience was the master of Balliol, he just retired. And when I pronounced this, because he'd already given a speech, you could hear murmurs in the audience, X, you didn't tell us about that in your lecture. Because obviously his lecture, which was about Balliol, was a work of total praise and accolade giving to his former college. So there's that. There's the fact that one of my predecessors in the Fraser Chair at Edinburgh, Professor Gordon Donaldson, in a wonderful one-liner, which I used to always use in lectures, by 1660, it was commonplace for the lowland parish to have its school. We used to think that educational revolution took place from the act of settling schools in 1696 and thereafter, but it was already there. Excuse me, I've got the Scottish disease of a slight cold, Scottish winter disease, that there was of a slight cold. And then there was the recognition of such works as the great legal framework, which was put in place in the institutions of the laws of Scotland, which was put in place and published in the 1680s. So I think the modern view would be not that the late 17th century had the total comprehensive and in-depth brilliance of the following century, but there's a lineament, there's a line of development from the late 17th century. There was no great caesura in 1700 or 1707. The men of the 18th century, the giants of the 18th century, were standing on the shoulders of perhaps lesser men, but still very active, that had gone before in the pre-1700 period. So that's one factor. The second factor is the Scottish connections overseas. People all know about the Scottish diaspora from the 18th century onwards. Ulster first, then Northern Ireland, that is, the north of Ireland, then the Americas, Canada and USA and the West Indies, and then India, and then what became Australia and New Zealand and South Africa. Eventually, by about 1850, certainly by 1900, it was a global diaspora. And again, I've written about it in some depth excuse the phone, it's in the other room. Scotland's Global Diaspora to the Ends of the Earth is the main title of the book. But what I'm going to say is before, and one of the reasons for that global diaspora was before 1700, Scots, clerics, academics, soldiers, mercenary soldiers, traders were all over Western and Central Europe, even as far away as Russia, from about the 12th century. It's an astonishing fact to me that between its foundation in the early medieval period and the Reformation, the University of Paris the Harvard, Yale, or MIT of its day had no less than 18 Scottish rectors. This was an indication of how plugged in were some aspects of the Scottish professional and clerical elites to European thought. And the area became particularly close in the later 17th century. That area was the Low Countries, or Holland. And Holland became the intellectual crossroads of the world because many dissidents who had been forced, unorthodox thinkers, if you will, who had been forced to flee from other countries in Europe, often congregated in the Low Countries. And there's a clear line of causation between Scots law in the late 17th century, but more critically, the great medical schools of Scotland, which only became great medical schools in the 18th century, and training at places like Leiden and Utrecht in Holland. So, second major force, the connection between, the fusion between what's already happening in pre-1707 Scotland and the if you like, the hybridity, the duality of that, plus the impact from Europe. There is some impact from England, because we know that Isaac Newton's highly original scientific thought was taught in the Scottish universities in the 1690s, even before it became commonplace in Oxford and Cambridge in that period. And then the final area, so you'll be glad to know we're coming to close to an end of this. The final area was the nature of Scottish society as it developed and existed in that key age between the 1730s and the 1790s, which is the heartland, if you like, the heartland period of the Scottish Enlightenment. That is not to say that major thinkers disappeared in the 19th century. I mean, James Clerk Maxwell, who was probably the greatest scientific genius of the 19th century in the world, was a classic indicator that there were still many men of brilliance in that particular period. But the depth and range didn't exist to the same extent as it did in the 18th century. So what was it about that period which might help us to understand the flourishing of this golden age of Scottish culture? One factor was there was political stability, because it was the period between the final defeat of Jacobitism in 1746 and the end of the counter-revolutionary movement of the Stuarts. And at the other end, the beginning of the Great Wars, which lasted so long, the titanic conflict between Britain and France for world conquest, for world dominion, for world empire. The period in between, apart from, of course, the American War of Independence, which didn't impact directly to any great extent in Scotland, it was a period of stability. And therefore, there was no longer the kind of strong schismatic oppositionism between Whigs and Tories, between different political groupings. It was possible now to have a semi-harmonious and civilized conversation without falling out over deep-seated political rivalry in that period than it had been before, or it became since, because in the 1790s, that was the kickstart period for political radicalism and an assault on the constitution of the UK and on the oligarchy of the governing of the property classes. So that's the bit in the middle. The second thing is during that period, we begin to see the Church of Scotland moving in what was called, in quote marks, a moderate direction, because the church started to be taken over by the party of moderatism, a party who wanted to not in any sense be at war with the state, but wanted to practice toleration, wanted to practice a degree of civility, wanted to adapt to some extent to secular society. So that also meant the erosion of much of the old bigotry of the past, because some of those who still held to the old ways seceded from the church in two major secessions in the late 1740s and in the early 1750s. It helped also that the Patronage Act of 1714 had given the landlord class the final regal right. Now it became a poison in the church right down to the Great Disruption of 1743. Gave secular landlords the right of appointment of church ministers. But one of the effects of it, of course, they were unlikely to appoint somebody who was not politically acceptable to the status quo, the political status quo, the social status quo of the period. So the Calvinist edge, the Calvinist edge which had existed in the 1690s began to erode. The climate for heterodox opinion, the climate for opinion which was different from orthodoxy, whether political or religious or social or philosophical, was in fact created in that period. And the final thing is this: from the 1740s, the Scottish economy was starting to move forward. The decisive break with the past between old Scotland and modernity occurred in the decade of the 1760s. But already from the 1740s, some of the outlines that were going to come about were apparent. In the introduction to Waverley, his first bestseller, which launched him into international stardom, Sir Walter Scott has the anonymous personality in the introduction, in the prologue, and looking back on the last 50 years or so, from 1811 to the last Jacobite Rising. And he stated in that introduction, and I quote, "There has been no country in Europe which has undergone so complete a change as has occurred in this kingdom of Scotland. It has rendered the population, it has rendered the people of this country in this era as different from their grandfathers, as the present English, that is the English, are from those of the days of Good Queen Bess in the 16th century." In that statement, Scott captured the telescopic nature of Scottish development, the faster, more wide-ranging, deeper scale of industrialization from the 1760s through to the 1830s and thereafter. But my point is, the prelude to this extraordinary leap forward, it was already beginning to develop in the 1720s, 1730s, but especially from the 1740s period. So more wealth meant more opportunities in what I would call the self-service sector of the Scottish economy. Ministers, clerics, school teachers, lawyers, those who didn't actually specifically produce wealth. Secondly, the openings became more available. And if you take architecture, for example, it was possible for landowners now, who were becoming increasingly rich in this period due to the rise in grain prices and the beginnings of industrialization, which meant there was more in towns and cities and therefore more demand for the products of the countryside. This is the background to the Adam family, to the people who designed the new town of Edinburgh. More money available for building, more money available also for the planning, the very careful and systematic planning of the countryside in that particular period. And also, of course, more availability of resource for the growth of the universities, several of which doubled, trebled in number in that particular period. By 1800, Scotland, per head of population, not in absolute terms, but per head of population, had more university places than any other country in Western or Central Europe. We don't have the data for Eastern Europe to the same extent, but it's unlikely that it was any different in that part of the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, before I collapse with the dreaded Lurgai or cold, can I just summarize the, first of all, I try to sketch out the features which name us to label the period of the 18th century Enlightenment. Secondly, also to try and draw out the distinctive features of that period, which you could say were either partly or wholly peculiarly Scottish. And then on to the paradox or the puzzle. It doesn't seem apparent that this was going to happen in such a country if you lived, say, in the late 17th or early 18th century. But I then tried to show that the late 17th century was not quite the society which had often been portrayed by much historiography in the 19th and early 20th century. It was more mature and more sophisticated than that. I mean, one point I used to always make in lectures. It was often used that the late 18th and 19th and early 20th century historiography always used the massacre of Glencoe as an indication of how savagery was still commonplace in late 17th century Scotland. Teaching undergraduate, I used to put that in its head and say, no, the massacre of Glencoe is remembered because it was unrepresentative of the period, because such savagery was commonplace in the previous century, the 16th and 15th century, and among the hatreds of the clan kindreds. And then, so finally, the influences, all of them important, all of them occurring at the same time, which might explain, excuse me, not the preconditions for enlightenment, because the preconditions were not a sufficient cause. They were a necessary cause. The preconditions were a necessary cause, but not a sufficient cause. The triggers, the actual stimuli, which resulted in this eruption, intellectual and cultural eruption, came then in the 18th century, based on those preconditions. Thank you very much.
Wow, I know everyone is applauding with their microphones muted. Sir Tom, that was enlightening, if you pardon the pun, and terribly interesting and delightful. I'd like to open the floor to question and answer. And then I know everybody wants to hear a few jokes from Sir Tom, but what questions do we have and discussion today, please? And you can please open your cameras so we can see you and unmute when you're speaking, please. Thank you.
Okay. Don't worry, I will not bite. I'll be very kind in my responses.
I have a question. I think that's a great talk. Thank you. I have a book here called How the Scots Invented the Modern World by Arthur Herman.
Sorry, there's one phrase missing in that. It's called "and everything in it."
Everything in it. I guess they didn't put it in my edition. It must be an American edition.
Yeah.
How good does this book that I have here match a little bit what you were talking about? It seemed to, with that hanging of that young boy in the late 17th century, I guess, or late 16th.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. The thing you have to remember about the Herman book is there's two important aspects of it. One is he's not a research scholar in any way of Scottish history. The book is very well written, and therefore the ease of reading means it's certainly worthwhile getting. But he perhaps lacks the nuances and some indeed of the more recent thinking and more recent research on the subject. And of course, the second thing is a degree of exaggeration in the extent to which Scotland was the unambiguous and clear leader in the whole field right across Europe in the period. It was very important. There's no doubt about that. But there was a lot, if you want to put it this way in terms of this metaphor, was a number of rivers and a number of streams in this process that was going on in the 18th century across the continent of Europe. And there's no doubt about it, Scotland was one of the biggest estuaries and one of the biggest rivers in that whole patina, that whole process. I'm not a fan of the Herman book myself. I would always tell undergraduate students to use it with a critical mind, but there's no doubt about it. One of the things it has done has raised the profile of the Scottish Enlightenment. But and I especially like that tail end of you think it's the American version, and everything in it. That always gets a tremendous laugh in a lecture in Scotland. Even though the Scots love to be praised and stroked, because any society which is living in bed with an elephant, like England, always likes to be stroked.
That must be the way the Canadians feel.
I think that's the case to some extent, but I also think the Scots have got an even bigger problem, because the Canadians are a relatively sensible and moderate population, very civilized in my view, because I've visited Canada often to give presentations, very polite and courteous. I am not in any way trying to compare them with another country, so we'll just leave it at that.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much.
John, did you want to ask a question? John C.
Yes, this is very much enjoyed that, Professor. I was wondering if you could make a few comments on the role of transatlantic slavery and its impact on the Scottish society in the 18th century, both the tobacco trade, the linen trade, and I believe, as you have frequently raised the question, did slavery make Scotland great?
Correct. I actually published an essay on that subject in 2000, I think it was 2011. In fact, in a journal which was edited in the States. I think it was called Britain and the World. So in a sense, you've answered your own question. The only work I've done in addition to that, because of course the conclusion to that statement was, if you take into account tobacco, raw cotton, and sugar, because the essay was about not only the USA, but it was about the Caribbean islands as well. If you take all that together, then undeniably, especially for a relatively poor country as it was in the 1740s, 1750s, those slave-related trades were a major driver of modernity. Remember I said in my talk, the speed and velocity of the Scottish modernization. And remember, unlike England's, not only was it faster than England's, which was a process of evolution south of the border, but in addition to that, and very importantly and very crucially, the Scottish experience were right across the board. It was industrial change, it was agricultural change, it was infrastructural change, it was urbanization. Where did the resources come from in a country with a relatively small market and with an inheritance of poverty? My argument is it came from these transatlantic trades, but not only that, the investment behavior of the merchant classes involved in them. The other thing I should say is this: my more recent work on this, in a book I edited called Recovering Scotland's Slavery Past. It was the first academic book to get behind the amnesia and the denial, and it was published as late as 2015 to find out the reality of Scotland's connections with slavery. I mean, there was a well-known saying in late 20th century Scotland, it wasn't us. It wasn't us. It was Bristol, it was Liverpool, it was London, but we weren't involved. And of course, they weren't involved directly in the slave business from Scotland, although Scots were heavily involved in those ports south of the border as skippers, crewmen, and very interestingly also as physicians on board slave ships. But in one of my chapters in that book, I took the argument further by carrying out a comparative analysis between England and Scotland and the impact of slavery on those two countries in terms of economic development. And my conclusion was unambiguous, that because England was more developed, had less need of external capital than Scotland, and if you look at what I've already mentioned about the nature of Scottish society, and it's three, in the mid-18th century, it's three great external trades for tobacco, sugar, and cotton. All of them could not have mushroomed in the way they did, but for enforced chattel slavery. That undeniably, I argued, at least I was pretty sure of my grounds, undeniably I argued Scotland's transformation was more dependent on chattel slavery, especially underpinning these trades and underpinning the search for fortunes by merchants and plantation owners across the Atlantic than England was. This did not go down well. But, you know, the role of the historian is to face the sometimes awful realities of the past without fear or favor. Without fear or favor. And based on, as far as possible, not evidence, but representative evidence, come to conclusions which may dismay, which may provoke, actually, and even might cause dislike for the author. But that's my trade.
Well, you certainly wouldn't be allowed to teach school in either Florida or Virginia right now.
That is brilliant. Especially since I used to be, as a young scholar, I used to be in and out of William and Mary College.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gus, do you have a question? Do you have your hand up?
I'm trying to soothe a very active 3-year-old here on my lap. So that was what my hand was doing. Sorry. But Sir Tom, that was incredible. I have a million questions that I could ask, but I want to be respectful of everybody else. But maybe I see Caroline raising her hand. Let me go to Caroline first, and then I'll come.
Well, thank you first, Gus, for that lovely remark. Thank you.
Go ahead.
So Tom, I just wanted to say thank you very, very, very much. That was so enlightening and fascinating. Thank you.
Well, see, this is it Caroline? Caroline, this is one of the, I went back to tell you about the professor who wrote or has stated, my subject was immature in 1964, it undeniably was modern Scottish history. But one of the great advantages of being a teacher and a lecturer in the period since, you can almost see the scales dropping from the eyes of the listeners with the question forming in their brain. I didn't know that. Whereas, English history, they've got now down to such a fine level of detail that, the stuff given in the schools in England has been there for some time. Obviously, it's been refined, but it's nothing like the historiographical transformation that I've been so very lucky to be involved in.
Hello, it's Caroline again.
Hi, Caroline.
I just wanted to say that my grandfather, Charlie Thompson, a Scot, who had a business in Liverpool.
Yes.
When he was a boy, there were still the slave pens on the docks in Liverpool. I mean, English people just don't think of or acknowledge Britain's role in slavery.
Well, I mean,
those
sorry,
penguins were
On you
still
go.
there until they were taken down for their metal in the First World War. And the other thing is, there is an amazing museum of the slave trade right there on the docks in Liverpool. There's nothing like it in this country, nothing like it in America.
Right. Well, I mean, there's nothing like it in Scotland either. I mean, one of the other chapters in that book about recovering Scotland's slavery past that I wrote, because obviously I edited it, but I also wrote 3 or 4 chapters in it. Lost to history. And certainly, as far as my trade was concerned, my profession, books and articles on the English relationship with slavery were pouring out from the 1930s. The book I referred to and calling it an academic research-based book was only published in 2015. And that was the first ever research-based evaluation to try and remove the condition of amnesia. I don't think in any sense it was conscious denial. It was amnesia. Because, you know, when I gave, and my colleagues who were in that book gave lectures all over Scotland, and there was considerable press coverage about its findings, the question always was, why wasn't I taught about this in schools? I mean, everybody knew, in a sense, the streets of Glasgow, many of the main streets are called after the great merchants of the 18th century. And that's just one indicator of the way that the imagery, if you will, of the slave period has gone down. But kids were being taught, and my first book was called The Tobacco Lords. But children in schools are being taught about the glories of the 18th century Glasgow tobacco lords. And they were extraordinary in the way they undercut and won the victory of tobacco importation from London and the English outports of Whitehaven and Bristol. But there was an underbelly to that, which was rarely mentioned.
Charlie, do you have your hand up? We can't hear you, Charlie. You may need to unmute.
That better?
Yes.
Go ahead, Charlie. We can hear you.
Is that better?
Yes.
I can certainly hear you.
Sorry. I was just saying, Sir Tom, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I was curious about relationships at that time. Obviously, a very close-knit intellectual community.
Yes.
I think there was a book recently, which I have not read, about the relationship between Adam Smith and David Hume.
Yep.
And I was wondering, through your research, if there were any other special relationships that are worth noting in terms of that period.
Well, I would say that the individuals concerned, and the 3 great cities. So this is getting steadily. This is getting steadily worse.
Bless you.
No, it's okay. It's not happened. The 3 great centres, urban centres, and this was an urban-led development, were Aberdeen, Glasgow, and Edinburgh. Sam Johnson, Dr. Johnson, when he visited St Andrews, came up with this wonderful statement. The college here is looking into its grave. And of course, that's also a colourful line that I sometimes use when there are St Andrews University people in the audience. But of course, it did recover. So it's Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Aberdeen. The people involved in this together with the professional classes of teachers, university academics, clerics, etc. At that level, in those cities, they all knew one another. I mean, if you ever walk down the high street in Edinburgh, where up until the development of the new town, most people lived, most professional people lived, there was no way they could avoid bumping into people daily. And of course, there was one of the things about the Scottish Enlightenment, which I love as well, was it was incredibly social. It was bathed in alcohol. Drink in the house on the high street. Dinners where drink was often a key part of the proceedings. So alcohol, wine, especially wine, and especially claret, lubricated the Scottish Enlightenment. So being a social process, these people all knew each other, and the kindred groupings crossing one another. And of course, it was also common for boys to follow their fathers into the academic profession or the legal profession in that period. And there was also crossovers from time to time between the elites, these intellectual elites in Edinburgh and Glasgow and Aberdeen, because they all began to realize by reading who were the men who were coming to the fore in this process of intellectual exploration. Because one centrality of the Scottish Enlightenment, it's another distinctive feature which I should have mentioned earlier. There were so many of them involved in what was called by David Hume himself, the science of man, how to understand the moralities of man and the nature of man. And so that's why mid-18th century Scotland became the cradle, the womb, if you will, of subjects like economics and anthropology and sociology, and of course, not least the queen of disciplines, history.
Ms. Saunders.
Hi, Sir Tom.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions, but you just bring up the point that everything is so small. And when I was in Scotland, I was shocked at, being an American. It's huge here. We're not ever anybody. And it was a feeling of coziness that reflects in the fact that if you disagree with someone, I don't want to see them the next day and fight with them. It's a environment shapes us, that. And
absolutely.
The fact that it was small, but also the fact that so many people could read, those to me were impactful in how I viewed it. But I was there in July 2019. Were you at the New Enlightenment at Edinburgh?
Yes.
Did you go to the party at Edinburgh Castle?
No. I think what tends to happen was that in summer?
Yeah, July.
Yes, July. Well, what tends to happen in summer, I own a small estate in the island of Mull as a clearing landlord. And the family migrate to Mull usually during it's not as if I just do nothing up there apart from walk and have a good time. I always also write. So during the summer months, I'm usually in the glorious Hebrides, unless I've got commitments, like giving a lecture or lectures at home or abroad. So I wasn't actually at that.
Well, I was there and I was by myself, and so I just roamed around and asked a lot of questions, but I stood at the gate of Edinburgh Castle with the security guard, and for 2 hours I just watched people go in and out who were attending it, and it was so much fun. And I also asked a lot of questions, but like two of the men that were there, one from the University of Virginia, one was from Berkeley, I think, and they were there. They were so excited to be there at the New Enlightenment. But I remember talking to the security guard, and I asked him, I said, you're Scottish, and what do you think about this amazing history you have, and how do you feel about things now? well, my question was, this was about the New Enlightenment, the 3 or 4 day symposium, but
Yes.
where do you think there's going to be a new one, if ever? You know, you talked about the preconditions that you need to have it. You needed to have it in Scotland. Well, I talked to him and he was not very hopeful about things, his about education, about his son being able to read. He wasn't, and that education in Scotland right now for him as a security guard was not very good for his children, and he didn't feel very hopeful. And so, and I talked to a number of people in around Edinburgh for the week I was there.
Yes.
And they didn't feel very hopeful. You didn't talk, I'm sure that that's part of the precondition for the Enlightenment to happen back then, but for this new Enlightenment that you all are looking at for our future, what do you think about that? What do you think that, you know, the title was Shaping Capitalism.
Yeah, I'll take that.
Sorry, it was long.
No, it's okay. I'll take that question also in relation to the security guard's comments. You've got to divide the educational profile of Scotland today into two parts. If you take the school level education, that is primary and secondary, and you look at the international league tables, it's not that education in Scotland is disastrous, but compared to the past, which of course is partly mythical. I mean, I was at a school where we boys, this was a senior secondary, that is, you had to sit a test at the age of 10 or 11. And those who failed went to a so-called junior secondary. Those who passed went to a senior secondary. Out of that year, there was something like 60 or 70 pupils, boys and girls. The place I was educated in eventually in the secondary was an all boys school. So there were 60 or 70 pupils, and out of that, 3 went to the senior secondary, no girls. And as one educational historian talked about it in, looking at the whole period from the late 19th century into the 20th century, it was, quote, the sieving, S-I-E-V-I-N-G, the sieving of the working class. So despite the fact that international league tables suggest that Scottish schools today are not up there in the top 3 or 4 in Europe, I think it's something like Estonia or Finland are. I mean, they should get people over there quickly to find out what the magic bullet is. But certainly compared to the education I had of in year 1, particularly for some reason the classics, Latin and Greek classes, young boys, only 12, sometimes even 11, had their hands on the heaters, knowing that the chances of being belted, with the toes, not for bad behavior, but for getting less than 8 out of 10 in the daily test. It's amazing to think of it compared to today. The chances were very high. And that's all gone, of course. But nevertheless, there is, as is, not about the 18th century period that I've been talking about, but certainly about the more modern period, the 19th and 20th and mid-20th century. There's a lot of mythology about how good it was, etc. But when you then turn to the universities, they are currently still the jewels in the Scottish crown. Let me give you some data. In the last, remember, we're dealing with a wee country of just over 5,000 people. In the last Times Higher Educational League table of universities, the top, I think it was top something like 4,000 universities in the world. That only includes a fraction of all the universities in the world. In that, there were 5 Scottish universities with, I'm delighted to say, my own institution, the University of Edinburgh, coming in at number 12. And that's a public university. There's nothing like the financial advantages of the Yales, Harvards, or Princetons of this world. And then the others, Glasgow, Aberdeen, St Andrews and Stirling. And if you look at the record of research, and this will of course be mainly scientific and medical research, by the number of citations, Scotland by head of population is just behind Switzerland. So the universities are still upholding the global standards, not all of them. There's another, I think overall we have 12 or 13 or 14 universities now. But some of them are upholding the global standards of the great 18th century predecessors. And that's good to know, because apart from wind power, with oil going, and the great industries of the past crumbling in the 1970s and 1980s, Scotland's major serious asset left is talent and brain power. But that was also its greatest asset in the late 17th, 18th and early 19th centuries, before the old economy, which has now disappeared. So I'm not entirely pessimistic, but you've got to remember economies of scale. It's very difficult in today's world, especially with the rise of multinationals, etc., for small countries to have the kind of the size of impact in a cultural or intellectual sense that Scotia did in the 18th century.
Sir Tom, may I jump in here just a moment? I think I won't ask a question. I would like to say that I was very struck by your points about the early beginnings of the Scottish diaspora, beginning simply through the natural migration and outreach of Scots to other countries in Europe and areas on the globe. So that was very interesting. I'm going to pursue that. And I know you're not feeling terribly well. Your cold is worsening.
No, don't worry about that. This is just, in fact, it's probably rhinitis and not a cold at all. But I'm looking forward to the dram, which will cure me after this is finished.
Well, and maybe you should be having that now if you have your.
What's your question, Tony?
I just, you know,
I'm thoroughly enjoying this.
Okay, good. I just am cognizant of the fact that you promised us a joke or two.
Yes.
And so we don't want to forget that.
Do you want me to give them now?
What do you say, folks? Gus, what were you going to say?
I had a question based on your comment, Connie, but first I bring the most important news that I could possibly bring right now, and that is from Murrayfield.
Brilliant.
Where Scotland are leading England 7 points to 6 at this very moment.
Oh, that is a trouncing. That is a trouncing.
If I could, I'll quote. One of my favourite books that I read, Sir Tom, on the beach at Achmelvik in the Highlands is To the Ends of the Earth, and I quote a great Chicagoan, Nelson Algren.
Yeah.
And my question is going to be about Scottish identity, but it's kind of flavoured by, give a Scotsman your attention for long enough, and I'll quote Robert Burns.
Yes.
Gifty Geas see ourselves as other Geas. Nelson Algren, of his lead character in Walking the Wild Side, Dove Linkhorn, said, fleeing his Scottish bondage for a life in the New World, word went on ahead. Beware of a wild boy of no particular clan, always ready and always armed, prefers drinking to toil, chasing women to battle or booze, but may try all three concurrently. One of my favorite quotations, but there is kind of the Scottish identity through the eyes of Nelson Algren.
Yeah.
Your book and many of your lectures have talked about what Scots became, what their own identities were. And I'm fascinated, of course, that the Chicago Scots, our principal charity is a nursing home.
Yes, I just wanted to, before you go on, just congratulate you on this. Thank you. I know, a whole range of Scottish clubs or societies throughout the world. There may be others doing what you're doing, but I don't know of them.
There's not that I'm aware of, but
it's a brilliant idea, especially in today's world.
It is, isn't it? And they always seemed to me to be distinct from one another, the kind of culture and care sides of the society. But really, when you cut it down to its quick, it's about home and family. And those two things are kind of at the heart of the society more than anything. But what of Scottish identity? It's a huge question. But what do you see of Scots and Scottish identity when they go abroad?
Well, the first thing that happens is it becomes stronger, obviously. This will vary over the centuries, but it's born, obviously, to a significant extent by their awareness of being a Scot in a larger whole within the WHOLE in Great Britain. It's traditional for societies, countries which are very close to big country, other much bigger countries, 4/5 population bigger, such as England, to assert their identity to a much greater extent than the big country would. So that's born in the old country, but then it's shaped after that by the number of what one would call emblematic means of asserting Scottishness. Everything from literature, even pride in what I've talked about today, the Enlightenment, the enormous contribution that the Scottish soldiers made in those two terrible conflicts in the 20th century, and the public celebration of Scottishness, which goes on throughout the world with the Burn suppers, etc., etc. A few other ethnicities have that kind of range of ways of asserting their identity. Now, that's not to say that dilution doesn't occur, because it's commonplace in immigrant societies when it gets to the third generation. But the way I see it, I'm not in any sense generalizing, because it's impossible to tell statistically how significant this is. But I see in the age of family history, with family history being second only to pornography and the internet, travel back to the homeland, which was perhaps left several centuries before. The third and fourth generations, on occasion, because of the ease of travel, because of the way family history can shape it through the internet, etc., maybe even having a greater awareness of their family identity and their Scottish identity or their Jewish identity or whatever. Because there's no doubt about it nowadays, especially in what used to be called the New World, but really across most of the countries outside Europe. There's a great interest in asserting, in a sense, across the universalism of humanity, ways of asserting your singularity, ways of asserting your differentiation, not in any absurd political way, but in terms of your culture and what you hold dear and where you came from. And if you look at, I'm very interested as a scholar in seeing the reaction of audiences throughout the world, and particularly in Europe, to, I think he's ill at the moment, so he doesn't appear very often, to the Dutch violin player and also orchestra leader, Henri Rieu. He's Belgian. And at the end of his concerts, not all of them, but very many of them, and you're talking about an average of 5,000 to 10,000 people in them. They have the hoardings at the back, Edinburgh Castle and the Saltire, etc. And because I'm known as a Scottish historian, he communicated with me because he's very interested in the impact of the Scottish tunes and especially the one that he says has more impact on the world, the global audiences he's been before, than Highland Cathedral. And of course, the irony is it was composed by two Germans. But that is the other thing about Scottish identity, that it's known globally for a whole variety of reasons I don't have time to go into. And we should be extraordinarily proud of that, but not become bumptious, because that will ensure that antagonism start to develop from other countries.
Thank you very much. And I should say that while you were talking, it's now 10-6 to Scotland. And we have a group of residents tuning in from the Scottish home at Caledonia to listen today. So hello to them. Thank you.
Hello to you all. And of course, this is quite important, that I may have brought Chicago Scots good luck, especially on the rugby field. Gus, can I ask you a question? How far into the game is it at the moment?
It's not half time. Oh no, it's just blown for half time.
Right, and it's 10-6.
Yeah. So in the words of my uncle Graham, who at my sister's wedding, when my father was giving the very proud speech, father of the bride, he looked at Kirsty and Justin and said, "What a lovely couple! They're so much in love. Isn't it wonderful for us to see how love is filling the air?" And Uncle Graham from the back of the crowd said, "Oh, there's time."
Very good.
So there's still time to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
Oh yes, that's typical. Okay, so listen, Connie, do you want me to? These are not jokes. These are two true stories. One of them, well, in fact, both of them involve myself. But one of them took place a long time ago. It took place in the 1980s, early 1980s. The other one more recently in Buckingham Palace, because I know that since the Crown became internationally popular, people have a fascination with the British royal family. They may have had before, but maybe even better one now. So can I first of all go to the early one? In 1987, I gave my inaugural lecture as a professor. You've got to understand that in that period, and still to a degree nowadays, there was probably only one professor or two professors per department. It's not like we're called assistant professors or other types of professor. There was the professor, and occasionally people who had also a personal chair because of their distinction. So this was I wasn't the head of department, so I had a personal professorship in Scottish history. And the inaugural lecture was a big thing. The Illuminati of the university were there. Friends and relatives were invited. It took place in one of the biggest university halls. Civic dignitaries and all that sort of thing. We were dressed in academic robes when I gave it. So I was launching into, I think it was the 10th minute. And out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my 7-year-old daughter getting up and walking out. And you could sense the atmosphere, what's going on. A slight tension. So I had very quickly to think about, it turned out that Katrina was going to the loo. But I had to very quickly think of something vaguely humorous to diffuse the atmosphere. So I said, that's young Katrina that's young Katrina. Always my most severe critic.
Very clever.
Right. So the second one, you might find even more. You might find funnier. It concerns a man of some wit, although a lot of it was dry, and some types of humour that people might not have found always attractive. It concerns the recently dead consort of Queen Elizabeth II, the Duke of Edinburgh, or Prince Philip. And this took place in 2000, I think 2012. So the Prince Philip was also the Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh. And one of the very good things he did for the university was to have a dinner in the state banqueting hall of Buckingham Palace for some senior university staff, but mainly for what we call targets. These were wealthy people from across the world, of course, as you would expect, to a significant extent from your own country, who were invited to Buckhouse, to Buckingham Palace, in order to experience the University of Edinburgh experience and hopefully be vulnerable to being asked for funding. There was two particularly wealthy men. They were both elderly, both Americans. The university had been trying for years to get them across. They were both in wheelchairs. Apparently within days of the invitation coming from Buckingham Palace, they had made arrangements to come over by plane. And then I was there. The senior manager of the university asked me to go along to it, to give the prince a gift. So we broke up after the dinner. One of the features, by the way, of those dinners, and certainly in terms of my experience, and I've been at two now, the wine follows in a very parsimonious way by the flunkies. You know, there's no bottles on the table. Guys come around, you know, a wee drop, and then away, maybe come back again later. But anyway, they're very careful with that. And of course, you know that the Queen every morning dines out of Tupperware, you know, with the cornflakes and them, etc. So we break off into this lounge area after that. And these men, you know, palace servants, are going around with cigarette trays with also cigars on them. You know, you used to see them in the old nightclubs where daintily clad, semi-clad women would go around with the cigarette. You used to see them in the old films. So he came up to my group, you know, they do the circulation. He came up to my group and said, I said to him, sir, that's quite interesting, you know, you allow cigarettes, you know, given the bans that exist outside and pubs and restaurants. I said, they got all sorts here. And then, wait a minute, that isn't the punch. It was brilliant. And he says, yeah, and they're from, and he gritted his teeth, and they're from all parts of the world. So then his equerry came up, that's a military officer who is kind of attendant, and he gave me the, I think it was the second or third edition of the Scottish Nation, and I think there was 2 additional chapters in it, and so the equerry says in his ear, Professor Devine wants to present you with this gift on behalf of the university as a thank you for your hospitality. So I hand it over to him like this, and he goes like this. Oh my God, not this again. I said, it's okay, sir. There's only 2 additional chapters. Thank God for that. Then walks away. That's the kind of humor I love. No, the kind of humor coming from him that I love.
Gus, I want you to tell Sir Tom, please.
I think another one-liner was when he was in Oban, I think, and he was talking to obviously the visit various places, and this was a driving school, and he was reputed to have asked the manager, how do you keep the natives sober in order to ensure they pass the test?
Sir Tom, I'd like to call upon Gus to tell you about the 3 types of human beings on the face of the earth.
There are Scots, there are people who want to be Scots, and there are people with no ambition whatsoever. But
Very good.
we welcome everyone who is Scottish by birth, by heritage, or simply by inclination.
By affiliation, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my last doctoral student was a Swiss German, and he now works. He's now a top reporter in the leading Swiss quality newspaper, and his thesis was on this group of, you would call them affiliate Scots.
Mm.
That is people in Europe who dress up as Scots, play pipe in pipe bands, organise military activity of the Scottish variety, etc., etc. And hardly any of them, if any of them, have ever been to Scotia.
Mm-hmm.
And he examined this book, and he examined this this phenomenon in a book called I think it was called Warrior Clans or something of that nature. Because of course, most of the way they dress up, it's got all the emblems of ferocity, you know, like axes and daggers and big broadswords, etc., etc. And it's a fascinating psychological volume, not simply for what it tells you about what's going on in these parts of Europe, particularly in Western and Central Europe and in Russia. You don't get it at all in the Mediterranean countries. It's a peculiarly Northern European phenomenon. And he's also got a couple of chapters at the end tried to probe the reason for this. When he was quite well into his research, we have 2 supervisors in Edinburgh, a main supervisor and also another one who may have expertise in the field. The other supervisor was a sociologist, and we had a drink one day in the pub, and we both agreed that we might need another supervisor for this stuff. That is somebody from the Department of Psychology.
I just want to thank you, Sir Tom, for taking the time to be with us today, and an open invitation when circumstances in your itinerary permits, whenever, consider yourself welcomed, invited, and we'll look forward to offering a warm welcome to Chicago to you.
That would be absolutely delightful.
First of all,
so thanks very much, Gus, for that. But the main thing is, it's been no difficulty at all. I've thoroughly enjoyed being with you all, albeit over the internet. So yeah, it's been really. We have the word for it. Gus will know this word. It's CRAIC. It's been good crack.
It has.
Well,
that's not an immodest word of praise for me. I'm talking about the exchange between us, social exchange.
Sir Tom, we've enjoyed this so much, and so we're not going to say goodbye. What I would like to say is see you very soon, because by popular demand, we'd love to have you back. And so we'll be reaching out to you soon so that we can see you again.
I'll do a weekly show if you want.
Well,
you see the way, by the
say.
way, Connie, you see the way I laugh at my own jokes. Because in my house, you know, I had 5 children. Unfortunately, we lost one when he was 21, but so we're still 4 of them, and I've got 10 grandchildren. I'm the only one that laughs at my jokes. That's why I laugh when I've finished a sentence, which I think is funny.
Sir Tom, I'd love to hear perhaps on another session like this or in person about your work on the borders and the clearances of the borders that I don't think enough people know about.
That's no problem. I mean, the other thing that would be possible is, you know, just a question and answer session. You know, I just sit here And you can ask me anything about Scotland in the past that you want to, but it's entirely up to you. One of the things, because of my kind of eclectic range of subjects that I worked on and published on, there's probably most things in the period from about 1600 I could talk about. But the main thing is, thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm going next door to get the dram from Lady Devine, who absolutely hates to be called Lady Devine.
Oh,
And that's why I'll always introduce her as Lady Devine to other people.
you should have brought her in with you. We'd like to meet her. Maybe we'll meet Lady Devine next time.
Well, she's a gorgeousness, still at her age as well. But the thing is this, that she probably wish to be dressed up. She probably wished to be presentable, as we say. And I don't know, she might even have left to go for my, to collect my son and one of my granddaughters. The granddaughter in question is competing in international gymnastics competition in Bristol.
Ooh.
So they flew down and they flew back, and Catherine's going to collect them from the airport. But next time she'll sit beside me, okay? And give false demonstrations of love and loyalty.
Okay, you can count on it, Sir
Right.
Tom. You can count on it. We will
Great to meet you
schedule
as well,
that
Connie. Great to
soon.
meet you as well.
Oh, it's been delightful.
You've got a very good sense of humor, almost as good as Gus's.
Oh, well, I don't want to belabor it. I do hope everyone will tune in next month. We're going to have Professor Donna Heddle, Director of the University of the Highlands and Islands Institute for Northern Studies.
Yeah.
So that's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
I haven't met her. So
Well,
we'll give her best wishes as well. So that's it's great that you do that sort of thing. But the greatest thing you do of all is is what you're doing for people in their later years.
The charity. Yes, Sir Tom, this is the oldest not-for-profit charity in the state of Illinois. It was founded in 1845 for the Scottish old people.
Yeah.
So we're very proud of it and would love to show you around the campus one day.
Absolutely. You've taken care of your own splendidly.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think this is pretty good for old people. Just talking. Much better than laying in a bed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Well, thank you. Thank you for being here, everyone. I know if you'll just raise your imaginary glasses and be upstanding to Sir Tom, we'll all have a dram in his honor.
I'm going to have a dram now, but not imaginary. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks very much for listening, and thanks also for your very cogent questions. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay.